Hello, welcome to Retropower Uncut episode 82. There's a lot of hammering going on next door, which I suspect relates to a certain MK1 Escort, which Nat will no doubt show you shortly. But you'll have to forgive all the banging, and the heater's just fired in, which is more noise. We're going to start with Morris. So John's been largely working on this over the course of the last few days. We've been doing the plumbing work. So we planned all the plumbing routing at the metalwork stage, and there are holes in the shell for anywhere where bulkhead fittings go through. There are holes in the shell for riv nuts to mount everything, or threaded bosses welded to the shell for that. So it's been going through and actually starting to lay some of that plumbing through. So in the back there, we've got on bracketry that we'd already designed before, the remote servo, because as you can fairly obviously see, there's not room for a servo in the engine bay. And with it being a road car, it did really want servo assisted brakes. So there's a remote servo in the back there. And then John's now done the lines between the master cylinders and these bulkhead fittings, which will come out to a reservoir which sits here. Now, if you remember when we were at the metalwork stage, we did a 3D printed version of what will be a billet machined aluminium reservoir that sits here. So we were mocking that up as well, just to work out the routing up to that. We've then done the outlet feeds from the master cylinders, which come through a set of holes down in the tunnel down here. The clutch one comes forward and across the cross member and back to the clutch, so it doesn't have to cross the routing of the exhaust. And then we've got the front and rear feeds. They run down the tunnel, attached to a set of welded bosses that run down the inside face of the tunnel, and they were all spaced at metalwork, so you can actually get through the holes in the backbone that links the rear diff and the gearbox, and you can get through the holes in that to do the bolts up. They run to another set of bulkhead fittings in the back there, which feed to the master cylinders on the remote servo. The rear circuit one comes back through another bulkhead fitting to the rear axle. Those lines are all done. And then there's another, the front feed then comes back up a set of clips on the tunnel, T-piece is off a T-piece at the front here and splits out to the front brakes. And then there's also the vacuum line, which is attached on a same set of clips that run that front line forward. There's a vacuum line running from the throttle bodies back to obviously the diaphragm on the servo with a one-way valve in it. And that pretty much ties up the brake plumbing. It's braided throughout, so we've done Teflon line -3 hose, stainless steel overbraiding on it, and they're swage type fittings, so you can get the type of fitting that's reusable, where you can actually put an olive in it and you can screw up the back part, and they can be disassembled and redone with a new olive. On this we go with the swage type fittings. They're just a little bit more confidence inspiring. So we mock them all up and then we take them to a hose place to crimp them and pressure test them all. We just have to mark the orientation on there. But yeah, does a really nice job of it. We've had sort of thoughts in the past over whether the slight amount of give that you kind of envisage there might be in this type of flexible hose versus a solid metal line gives you any type of sponginess on the brake pedal. But in all honesty, in all the cars we've ever built, when we've done quite a lot in hardline and quite a lot in full braided throughout, and I can't honestly say I've noticed any noticeable change, and especially on a car where it's going to have a servo assistance anyway, we tend to go with braided flexible lines throughout. So that's where we're at with that. We've done the fuel plumbing too. We've not connected up to the tank because we're waiting for the tank to be fabricated. But Stu had already made a cradle that holds the fuel pump and filter under the sort of rear of the bulkhead there at the back. It basically sits just above the diff nose. And we've done the fuel lines running all the way through up to the fuel rail, regulators mounted down here on a bracket that we did when we were at the metalwork phase. So fuel plumbing's done, brake plumbing almost there, just a few more clips to put on, servo vacuum plumbing's done. So yeah, we're making good progress on that lot. We've got some of the interior stuff in progress on this as well. So Stu had already made the centre console in steel and the lower dash in steel. Last week Dean took over with those, foamed them and leathered them, so they're done in like a really dark charcoal, almost black leather. And then the rest of the interior is going to be following on soon. He's patterned the leather for the seats, which are going to be two tones. So they're dark leather on the sides with a lighter grey leather in the centre section. And he was just holding fire on one little job we wanted to do on the seats, which was to put a fairly strong anchorage point on the side of the backrest to put a loop on for the seatbelt to pass through. When we did the metalwork on the shell, the only real place with any sort of structural strength to it that you could put a seatbelt anchorage is actually in the section below the rear window here. So we put those vertical braces in, the ones with the punch swaged holes in, to strengthen up that area, so it was reasonably rigid. So we'll have the inertia reels down the bottom, and they come up over what will be effectively the shoulder mount on the bottom of the window frame there. But it's quite low down, and it means that the belt will be going up and over your shoulder, which obviously in an accident is not ideal because it will be compressing down on you. So because we couldn't find a better position anywhere in there, the plan has always been to add some structure into the seat to hold the seat belt higher. So we took some of the foam apart on the seat and basically welded a section onto the metalwork of the backrest on the seat, which will later on have a billet machined guide attached to it, so the seatbelt will run over that guide, so it's held up higher. So that kind of all falling into place as per the plan. Hopefully the seats will be done in a couple of weeks' time, and we're just forging ahead with mechanical stuff. We won't go too far before we pop the shell back through to the body shop to wet sand and buff it all to get the final finish. This is just a from the gun finish at the moment, but while they were making a bit of a head start with the Land Cruiser prep work, we just wanted to get some mechanical work done on this. So that's where we are at with that. Mustang, I think we showed a sneaky peek of the fire up on this last week. Am I right in thinking that at the very end of the video? But I don't think we actually discussed it. We said it was going to happen. So yeah, first fire up was last week, and it went without a hitch. I was actually off the day it was done, and I'm just trying to think whether I've even seen it running. I don't think I have. I think I've only seen it running in the videos I was sent. But by all accounts, it went incredibly smoothly, just fired straight up. There was a blow on one of the manifolds. That's since been taken off, and it was down to the fact that there was the flange had pulled when it was welded. Not by us, I hasten to add, it was an off-the-shelf manifold. So we re-linished the face of that flange flatter, and that seems to have solved that. We've fired it up again since, and it was free from the exhaust blow. So yeah, excellent in that sense. We've got brake plumbing all in place, power steering plumbing all in place, engine's been run as it stands, no issues on that. Transmission oil's in, the prop shaft's in. Essentially it could be driven, except for the fact that the wiring to fire it up was just kind of temporarily in place. So that one of the next things we're going to do is finish off the wiring and loom that all up and get that in properly, so it can actually be started on the key rather than with a cobbled up setup. And in the meantime, we're starting to go through some of the rest of the general assembly work. So we're kind of swearing a bit at the door glass and rear quarter glass alignment at the moment. Everything's new on the car, almost all the metalwork was changed, including the doors, which were bought as just complete units. And some of the mounting holes for the window regulators, which are also new, are a bit questionable. So we're elongating holes and just trying to get the glass to sit exactly right when it's wound up. There's a channel that sits at the back of the glass, which again is just not a great design. It's way wider than the glass itself. So there's a lot of movement in it. So we're just trying to do tweaks and changes to all of the new parts, which are a bit substandard, to try and make everything fit a little bit nicer, and just windows roll up and down nicely and seals contact nicely. But we're getting there. We're breaking the back of it, so we're just carrying on with that. Then we're going to do the seat mounting and just start bashing the interior together, because as soon as that's in, we can get the glass in and it's more or less drivable at that point. And we'll probably change the wheels at some point. A few people might have passed comments on the tyres on it. But I think somebody mentioned the tyres being the wrong way around. They're just a temporary set of wheels and tyres. They're the tyres that the car came into us on, but we are getting replacement wheels for it. It just hasn't been a priority. We can change them any time, so they'll go on at some point over the course of the next few weeks. And then we're waiting to complete the interior for a dash from Dakota Digital instrument cluster. We've been waiting quite a while for that, and it's still on quite a long lead time. I'm imagining electronic component sourcing might well be the hold up there, but hopefully we'll get that soon enough. So that's where we're at with that. Briefly, Utah, I've been carrying on a few jobs on that. I'll just squeeze around here. I got to the point where I was going to run through and spanner check everything on it after we'd done the clutch master cylinder, or sorted the fault with the clutch master cylinder. And then there was something I wasn't quite happy with, which was on the steering, the joint between the steering UJ and the rack. It had a Bodyshell UJ on it, which is an American-made universal joint, or certainly an American-supplied universal joint. It's 3/4 inch, 48 spline, very commonly used, and it's the same on Jag. And it's the type where you have a grub screw in the side rather than a split in it and it pinching up. And I wasn't very happy with the fit of the spline. It goes on and it wasn't slipping, but there was a small amount of play between the female and the splines in here and the splines on the rack. And although when you tighten the grub screw up, it takes the play out of it, I just wasn't happy with that arrangement, because when you're using a grub screw like that to take the play out of a spline, you're pulling it all the play across to one side, and effectively then the splines are only really engaging properly on one side. So we've actually redone the UJ with an end from a company down the road, which is of this type, where there's a split in the side and it pinches up, which just seems in my head a nicer way, because you're getting an even loading around all the splines when you pinch that up. So that's been done now. I've just literally been tightening that up earlier today, so hopefully that'll be back on for driving. It's been snowing today, so it's really roller coaster weather at the minute. It's sunny one minute, it's snowing the next. Hopefully tomorrow the weather will be a bit nicer. But that's where we're at with that. In the background over there, conveniently, live on camera, George is scanning the E-Type. So we'd done a lot of modelling work. I think we showed some of it last week on the rear end. We were basically trying to get the shape of the rear valance and the bumper nailed down. We're very happy with that now, but we're at the stage where we need to model the rear arch shape a bit more accurately, and we feel that we need to get the rest of the car in the model, because we were only working on the back end, and we'd only scanned the whole car with no front end on it, no bonnet on it. So we've now refitted the doors, fitted the bonnet. We put a coat of primer over those just to give them a dull finish that scans a bit nicer. You can get like a scanning spray which evaporates off, but it's actually quite expensive stuff, and it makes much more sense when we're not working with something that's already in its final finish. We know we're going to be stripping and painting it anyway. It's easier and cheaper just to blast a load of primer over it. So we've primed the doors and bonnet, fitted those, put the windscreen in place, and George is just scanning all of that part of the shell now, so we can assemble all of the different scan parts together and actually get a full 3D model of the whole car. And that way we can visualise the changes we've made with the whole car there, which I think before we make any final decisions will be important. We're going to make some changes to the front end as well. The headlights will be different. We'll be cleaning up where the side light and indicator units are. They'll be going and smoothed out, slightly different grille, and as I just said, we want to finalise the rear arch shape as well. So yeah, looking forward to seeing the scan data from that and that model taking shape. I would say the only other thing that springs to mind in this side of the workshop is we got a load of billet parts. We've been, over the course of the last few months, doing a lot of design of parts for the Land Cruiser project, and the first batch of those parts came through this week. So that was the switches or the knobs for the switches on the dash. There are 5 of those. 4 smaller ones, 1 slightly bigger one. You probably remember from a few episodes ago, we based those on the design of the front hub locking caps that are in the centre of the wheel, and they're quite a cool design. So we did like a miniature version of that with 1 extended fin that will designate whether the switch is on or off. We got the rear light protectors, which sit around the rear light units to protect the lenses from being broken. Brackets for the rear door check straps, so one bolts to the door, one to the shell, and there'll be like a fabric strap between the two to stop the doors overextending. And what else was there? The wing mirrors. I should remember that because Jamie behind the camera there nearly got one of the little nylon inserts stuck in them earlier. So they comprise the main mirror housing, two little blocks on the back which have little nylon inserts in them with a sort of half ball socket machined into them, and they'll clamp up onto the ball that's on the end of the original Land Cruiser wing mirror mounting bar, and you can basically preload that up with the cross bolts to get the right amount of tension to allow movement of the mirror but without it flopping around, and then those blocks in turn bolt through from behind the mirror glass into the main unit. And then the rest of it's all original. So the actual block that mounts to the door and the bar are original Toyota parts. We just thought it was a nice touch and a bit more high quality, because the original mirror sort of glass holding part is plastic on the original car, whereas all the rest of it's metal. So we basically replaced the plastic bits with metal. On that note, I think that's everything through here. Yeah, so I'll hand over to Nat and he can show you what all of this hammering in the background is all about. I'll catch you next week.
Right, well, thank you, Cal, for the handover, and thank you, Jamie, for that little montage of the work we did on Friday, the removal of all of the front of the car. we removed the Project 1, obviously, skipping around there, for those that are following the project, the MK1 Escort. We removed we sort of cut off at the bulkhead, removed all the front end, remove the floor, remove the chassis rails, back to the rear rails. Those who aren't familiar, the rail section, chassis rail sections in a MK1 and MK2 Escort are in 3 sections. There's the boot floor section, main centre section under the floor, then the front section running alongside the engine bay. So we removed the front and centre sections of the chassis rails, but kept the rear sections. There was nothing wrong with the rear sections, and we're not actually removing all of the boot floor, some of it. And we have got to cut those rails around anyway for the IRS installation, so it seemed silly to remove those as they were going to be altered and aren't rusty. So all that was removed. That was end of play on Friday. When we finished on Friday, that was all done, but with rough edges everywhere still. So Monday morning, all the edges were cleaned up, all edges prepped and tidied, and everything got ready for installation of parts. Then the towers were removed from the jig. We did a little check because when we removed the front end of the car, we actually had a bit of a spring. This car had some crash damage on the offside front outer, well, it had a new outer wing, and it had some crash damage on the offside front inner wing. When we removed it from the jig, it did actually spring a little bit. Those with eagle eyes will have probably noticed the weld runs across the bottom of the strut towers, the slightly ugly weld runs down here across the strut tower supports on the jig. I actually did those to shrink and pull the towers upright because the car was slightly out. And obviously I had to make the jig to fit the car really, as the car was on the jig. So what I did is I made the car to fit the jig, and then I used some weld shrinks and a couple of hot shrinks to pull the towers upright, so that we've now got the strut towers in exactly the right place. So following on from that, we've then rebuilt the front end of the car. We'll wander around to here, and we can sort of see where things are at. It's coming together. It's not all permanently fixed together. We've got the inner wings are fitted, the chassis rails front to rear are now fitted and connected, the bulkhead's fitted permanently, the scuttle top is temporarily fitted. That's got to come in and out a couple of times for spot weld access and for fitting some further parts. And the front end the inner panel is fitted, but not at the top, so we've got a little bit of fine adjustment, and the outer front panel is only screwed on at the moment. We won't be fitting those until we fit up the outer wings and we can fit the bonnet, and in order to do that we need the doors in place, and in order to do that we need to change the body sides. So that's that. I'm going to scuttle round to this side of camera now just to keep Jamie on his toes so I can gesticulate here. As you'll have noticed in the shot slightly earlier, we've removed this body side as of about 5 minutes ago. We've removed this complete body side now. All the edges are rough because we've just taken that off, and there are a couple of areas on the car where it had seen some welding and got mixtures of plug welds and seam welds and goodness knows what on a couple of edges. So there's a couple of areas where it's a bit rough and we've got to do a bit of tidying up, and obviously we've still got to straighten all these edges and prep them all. But that body side's now off, ready to be rebuilt with new Magnum front and rear body side panels which join to make a complete body side as per the original, as I mentioned last week. So that's all getting there. We've obviously got to clean all this up. We'll paint all this with anti-corrosion epoxy primer. We'll just brush paint this with anti-corrosion epoxy primer all inside these areas. Somebody I noticed in the comments had asked about why not blast it with the body sides off. Problem is, if you blast it with the body sides off on a rotisserie, you stand a good chance of bending the shell unless you build a lot of scaffolding into it, which takes quite a long time, and you don't need it after you've done that. So it's better at this instance to take the front wings off. The front end's fairly strong. At the back, leave the quarters on. They're generally not too bad usually inside the quarters, as this demonstrates. It's not too bad. So we'll clean all that up with a stripping disc, a strip and clean disc in an angle grinder, just to clean it up and clean any bits of rust off. And we'll brush paint all that with epoxy anti-corrosion primer, a Ceramix anti-corrosion primer that we use. And that'll be painted inside all the hollow sections on the roof. Obviously, that's another point I'd kind of skipped over. Obviously, we've removed the roof. In order to remove the body side, first you have to remove the roof. The roof is welded in the front and rear screen apertures and is welded into the onto the gutters, and the gutters in turn are spot welded to the body side. So when the car was built, that was the order. So you have to take the roof off first to be able to get at the gutters in order to be able to get at the body sides to detach those. And on that subject, I've forgotten the chap's name now. I think it was Neil Price had commented, pardon me if I've got your name wrong, a chap had commented on the YouTube video last week where I'd asked about the production of these at Halewood and the order of production, and he'd commented really regarding later Escorts, but saying that the body assembly process was largely the same, and that on the later Escorts, I'm assuming Mark 6, Mark 7, because he was referring to her removing the line from the plant when it was taken over by Jaguar. So I'm assuming it was Mark 6, Mark 7, and it referred to the body being built in 3 assemblies, which were then 3 sub-assemblies, which were then dated together by the companion holes on a marriage section on their line. Now that ties in reasonably well with how I think these shells were built on the line. However, I think these were only 2 sub-assemblies at the point they were actually married, but I may be wrong. But my surmising was based on where there are spot welds that are inaccessible later on. I touched on it last week, but I'll go slightly more into detail now. Those who know Escorts know that the middle, the centre and rear chassis rail sections are sleeved together and they're puddle welded, not spot welded. The only reason they would have been puddle welded, not spot welded, is if they weren't accessible with a spot welder. And that is the case. If the floor is fitted, then there's no access into that section with a spot welder, which suggests to me that the front and centre sections, which are spot welded together, were then slid into the rear section and puddle welded after there was a floor above. Which suggests to me that the floor and body assembly basically from here back was assembled as a complete sub-assembly with the rear chassis rails, but without the centre and front chassis rails. And then the other point that's a big clue, the clue on the front spot welds is that the front chassis rail here, well, the inner wing and front chassis rail here is spot welded to the centre rail. It's not here. We don't have a spot weld tip to get in, so we're going to stitch weld that. From Ford, that was spot welded, which means that was done before this bulkhead was there. Else there's no access to the back of that for the spot welder. So that was certainly done as a sub-assembly prior to the bulkhead being there. So, but then interestingly, originally, we've changed this. This is the bit I was talking about changing. The bulkhead, this section is part of the side of the bulkhead called the splash guard, people call it, but it's actually the end of the bulkhead. This was originally, from Ford, spot welded to the outside. It was the third, there are 3 layers. There's the inner A-post, this piece. There's a centre section, which is the hinge pillar, which actually has the reinforcer that carries the hinges inside it, and then the bulkhead section. So actually the lower part, there's 4 sections, but those sections, the bulkhead was on the outside, the outermost part. And as far as I can see, the only reason for that being on the outside was if it was added last in that assembly. So I'm fairly sure, ignoring the scuttle, take the scuttle out of the equation, I think that the front end with the front chassis rail and centre chassis rail section was a sub-assembly, and then all of this, the floor pan and the body side structure and all the rear structure was another sub-assembly, and they were slid together. And that this point here, where this panel overlaps the pillar, was a sliding point for adjustment, basically, and that the chassis rail mating point was also a sliding point, which means that the body shell overall length could be controlled by allowing the overlaps to change on the rails and here, and it's basically is only those points. It's the joint here and along and across the bottom of the bulkhead and on the chassis rail. There would be at least 10 millimetres of adjustment there, which would be more than enough to get the overall length of the car adjusted to be correct. And at that point, you wouldn't be affecting any gaps. The door would already be fitted and gapped to the rear of the quarter correctly and the hinges welded on in situ through these access holes here, which would have been access for a welder from inside the car. And then the front end would be mated to that and datumed. And then the outer wings would be fitted and gapped to the front of the doors. They overhang the front panel, so that it's not very dimension critical at the front. As long as the overhang's equal on the bonnet and the wings, the overhang of the front panel means that the overhang by the headlight on the front panel and over the top of the front panel means that that dimension of wing to door wouldn't actually mess anything up at the front of the car, and then the end of the valance is actually quite bendy and would actually bend to allow that tolerance. So that's my take on how that all goes together. And then the scuttle goes on last. Again, there's a big sliding tolerance on the front of that because there's a big step that welds to. And on the roof, and the roof definitely goes on last. I've got some photos of Mark II Escort production, and certainly on those, the roof is the last part fitted as far as I can see in terms of body shell welding operations. So that's how I think the shells were put together. It's not quite how we've done it. We've done it more or less the same, but we did put the rails in and weld them prior to dropping the floor in on top, because we had the benefit of being able to pull the floor in with some straps, put it in and drop it in and then weld it, which is a bit more convenient, not really a production line technique. And we've also decided to weld the bulkhead to the inner A-post rather than the outer, just because it means I can get those 2 parts joined in place and more rigid and more capable of supporting some structure here while the body side's removed. Otherwise, this is extremely bendy and is likely to, I'd be purely relying on the jig, which is just out of shot on the welding bench next to Jamie there. I'd be purely relying on that to hold all this structure in place while I build the sides. And there are points where I need to remove that, like now, to get the old body side out and get the new parts in place and aligned. I have to remove that jig section, which is why it's all bolted down to these plates. That was all done and constructed in situ. That's the first time those bolts have been out, was again about, well, probably now 10 minutes ago, when Tom took the body side jig off so that we could get the body side out. So that's where we're at now. We've got a lot of cleaning up to do around all the flanges on the side. We'll get the two halves of the body side, which have a joint about here and about here as they come from Magnum, as I explained before. So we'll do that. We'll get those, once all the edges are cleaned and prepped, and the edges on those are cleaned and prepped and everything's painted, we'll get those in place, clamp them in place, put the jig back in on the side, put the side beam jig back in, then we can reclamp everything to the jig, check all the alignment, check the alignment around the back. We've got the boot aperture jig there, we've got the window aperture jig in the front, we've got the window aperture jig in the back, so that'll give us the alignments all the way around there. We can make sure everything fits. When it does, then that can all be spot welded in place, and as I say, we'll join and braze the joint in the middle of the body side there, so that basically appears as one in the metal prior to any prep going over it. And that's where we're at. So yeah, Monday, we're Thursday now. I'm actually not here tomorrow, but Monday, in fact, Tom's not here and I'm not here tomorrow. So Monday we'll then be carrying on, picking up, cleaning all this up, getting all this ready and carrying on. Hopefully, I would like by the end of next week for us to have both the body sides done and the rear panel done. So then the back half of the shell is done, and then we can work on getting the doors on, make sure the gaps are good, work on the gaps on that. That's where pace will slow down once we start getting into gapping, in that does take time. Getting the panels together when you've got a jig to fit them to is relatively quick. There's a bit of measurement involved, and we had a couple of little setbacks this week, but it's relatively quick. When we start doing gapping, time gets absorbed in just adjusting and filing and tinkering and putting doors on and off about 500 times and all that sort of thing. So that's where time will get absorbed. We had a bit of we had some fun and games earlier in the week with the spot welder. We were struggling to get enough clamping pressure, even with the new spot welder on the very long spot welder arms on galvanised steel. So we had to do a bit more cleaning off than we wanted to, because we were struggling to get the pressure you need to weld 2 layers of galvanised steel together with the very long reach arms on. So we had a bit of a setback there, but we've worked around it by doing some cleanup. And I think with all my waffle there, we've probably covered more or less where we're at with Project 1. So yeah, next week, all being well, as long as there's no disasters, we should have body side on this side, body side on the other side, and hopefully the rear panel done. So we'll see how close we get to that idea when we do the walk around next week. So that's that lot. Past 1 or 2 welding clamps, we'll wander over to Churchill, which has developed an object in its engine bay. Stu's been beavering away on this and got to the point with the body at the tail end of last week. You saw Jamie's very nice montage and lovely edit of the rear of the roof getting fitted as a sort of cooperation between Stu and Tom. Stu did a beautiful job of making that section, as you saw last week. Absolutely lovely job of that. Tom's done an equally lovely job of getting it all welded into the roof, which is quite a challenge, but that's all welded in and now panel beaten. Don't think it's metal finished yet, it's not filed or anything yet, but it's panel beaten and in, and the levels are all good and it looks pretty much right. I haven't actually been over it in fine detail, but I'm told it looks pretty much spot on, so it will do, because they know what they're doing. So that's done and looking really good now. So Stu's moved on from the back end, moved away from the panel work on the back. There's a couple of minor decisions to be made there. There's a pretty good route to knowing what that's going to look like in place, but there's a couple of things we're going to do to making that a little bit easier, which we'll allude to when we've got some footage of the relevant things, which I don't know if we've got in this video. What Stu's moved on to is the engine bay. We know we've got some work to do on the bulkhead. We know we've got some work to do generally in the engine bay. We're fitting the XJR 6 as it's known. That wasn't what Jaguar called it, but the Jaguar XJR fitted with the 4 litre 6-cylinder supercharged engine, the earlier X300 XJR. We're fitting that engine. and it's a big old engine. So there is, in an XJ, there's an enormous engine bay. We're putting in a much narrower engine bay on this car. So Stu's been working on that, stripping ancillaries off, stripping parts off to enable it to be got into the engine bay, working out the alignment front to rear to be able to get it into the engine bay, and working out what modifications need doing to the bulkhead and the footwells and all that sort of thing, to enable it to all be fitted correctly and for us to have controls in the right places and all of that good stuff. He's now started work on the inner wing areas to get clearance, and also to modify the front crossmember, modify the front of the body, because we're going to be creating a new front valance on this. So he's been working on modifying the front of the car to enable that valance to be fitted, moving the front chassis crossmember back, removing the outer front chassis cross members, because we're going to be modifying those. The crow's feet, as they're called, that come out here and support the ends of the wings, they're being modified. And also just rethinking the ancillary drives on the engine a little bit. But that's not too bad. The power steering pump on these is shaft driven, that can stay. We've got room for an alternator. We're going to have to make a little access hatch in the inner wing, not unlike on the Mark II Jag. There was originally an access hatch, which you can probably just about see in there, which was originally where the remote servo sat on these. Well, we're kind of changing that. There isn't going to be that there, but what we're going to do is put a similar access hatch to the other side, which will enable alternator removal, because there won't be any way of getting the alternator out other than through the inner wing. It'll be too tight to get out from the front. Everything's tight on these in the front because of the tapered engine bay. So we're going to have an access hatch for alternator removal, and we're very seriously contemplating, we haven't used it before, but we've had good reports from a number of people, so we're very seriously contemplating using an electric drive air conditioning compressor on this car, principally because there isn't really room to get one on the engine. We could, but it would be a little bit compromised, so we're at the moment strongly considering, but still talking to a couple of people that have used them, an electric drive air conditioning compressor. That's the loose plan at the moment. So yeah, Stu's done that. We're then in the early stages of planning all the cooling and planning where we can get air in and where we can get air out of the front end of the car, because these supercharged engines do, even on standard, which is very moderate boost levels. I believe these run somewhere in the region of 6 psi boost, though I might be corrected. Could be 8, but I think it's only 6 psi boost. They're quite a moderate boost level. Even at that, the heat buildup is quite dramatic. You know, we need a number of coolers. We need an engine coolant radiator, the main radiator. We would like to run a separate. Jaguar used the same radiator to cool the charge air. I would kind of like to separate that process, really, because the charge air should be running a lot cooler than the engine coolant. So we'll be running a separate charge cooler radiator. We need to cool the engine oil either by the water or by an oil to air charge cooler. We need to cool the transmission fluid for the automatic transmission, and we need to cool the refrigerant for the air conditioning. So that's effectively 5 liquid to air coolers that we need to house in the front of the car and get sufficient air into and out of. So that's the stage we're at, really, with all that at the moment, is planning that lot, working out where we can get all that in without compromising how the car looks. So it's a pretty big challenge, but Stu's sort of just started all that now. Plus, obviously, in similar fashion to what we did with Utah, for those with long memories or that have gone back through the episodes of the Utah build, re-engineering the bulkhead to enable us to have the air feed from the front of the car routed all the way back into the dash assembly to feed nice cool air into the HVAC unit, which will be in the dash, buried in the dash of the car. I noticed there was a comment on the last video about why not hang the heater unit in space and build the entire car around it, with reference to the Escort, I believe, and it was very accurate indeed. That is always the way. The flipping thing is always a pain to house. It's interesting. It's an area we talk about a lot. Is options and ideas and engineering of HVAC units, because it's always buried in the car. It kind of needs to be buried in the car because that's where its output needs to be. but it's always a nightmare to work with and ends up being the worst part of the car to access. So yes, a comment very well on point there with the, with the build the car around the HVAC unit and build it around the heater, because you more or less do. It seems a bit converse to a sensible idea, but it is always how it works. So yeah, that's where we're at on Churchill. And then we'll have a little wander into the body shop, where I think Steve's still beavering away. I'm going to open the curtain a bit, those Jarkle can get in. We'll wander into here. Yeah, Steve's working on a lower section of front outer wing for the Land Cruiser. We've found a few little pinholes in a couple of the panels after blasting and epoxy priming, so we've had to just tidy a couple of, sort a couple of those out. I think we've put a couple of drops of TIG braze into a couple and welded a couple up as well. So we've sorted those out. And they're getting pretty well through the panels now. We're on the finishing on the later stages of the main front wing sections, aren't we? And then on the sort of upper, it is not lower, the upper part of the front outer wings, Steve's working on there now. The body side outer filler work's done, the rear quarter upper body sides. The rear door primary work's done, the main body tub primary work's done. Looks like Gaz has just started on the primary filler work on the bonnet, tidying up the edges where there was metal repair done there. There's some dents in them, little bits bent on the corners, and they were sorting out some little bits of grot that were trapped in seams. There's a case in point of where some time goes. When people question where time goes on these sort of jobs and how can it possibly take that many hours. Here's a case in point on the bonnet. There's a little spot welded in section under the bonnet, under the sides of the bonnet on these, which holds. It's a typical Toyota fashion, a very thoroughly engineered bonnet prop holder, and it's spot welded to the side of the bonnet seam, and it traps rust in there, and getting rid of it isn't actually quite that easy a job, because you've got to remove the spot welds to get that part out, which means cutting it off initially, then grinding the spot welds out to release them, because you don't want to drill them, because you can't get in to drill it without drilling holes in the sides of the bonnet. As soon as you weld that edge of that bonnet, it will shrink and curve the side of the bonnet completely, and then it'll be a lot of work to get it straight again. So we ground the spot welds off, then remake a bracket that we can then epoxy panel bond into here, because it doesn't need to be welded. It's not a structural part. Even if it was a structural part, it could be bonded anyway, but it's only a bonnet prop holder. So we've decided to create a new bracket which is similar to the old, that will panel bond into the epoxy panel bond into the corner of the inside of the bonnet. But there's a couple of hours work, probably a little bit more than a couple of hours work, in just making the bracket, detaching the old one, and removing any little bits of rust and grot that were trapped under it. So that's the sort of thing where time goes on these projects. It's just a little simple bracket that was under a bonnet that had what amounted to a sort of handful of little patches of crustiness underneath it. But if you don't do that, then inevitably within a couple of years of use there'll be rust bubbling out from this corner here, and suddenly this lovely rebuilt vehicle will look scruffy, and the bonnet will be dissolving as they did originally. So it's the fine details like that take the time and that make the difference to the finished vehicle. That's just a little case in point there. So yeah, that's pretty much, I think, where we're at with Land Cruiser. It's getting, I would say, hopefully, fingers crossed, all being well with a bit of a following wind. Next week we should be in polyester spray surfacer on all of these parts, I think. I don't think there's any reason why not. We should be in spray surfacer on all that lot, and it might all look sort of one colour. So watch this space and we'll see next week. So hope you've all enjoyed our little walk round, and see you again in a week's time.